is a first-person survival horror game where the player takes control of a character named Daniel, who wakes up in a mysterious medieval castle with no memory other than his name and background at the start of the game. The player initially starts in a room with a window and a constant sound of trailing water. The player is required to explore and solve puzzles in order to advance further in the game. The game comes with two modes, which are normal and hard. With hard mode, the consumables are reduced and the damage taken by the player increases exponentially. The game mainly revolves around the player's ability to interact and utilize objects around them to access areas in the level's environment. Interaction with items usually involve puzzle solving and collecting them to make progress. Unlike other horror games, Amnesia is a game that is intended for the player to run and hide from the monsters instead of trying to confront and defeat them. Rather focus on ways to end pursuits by briefly escaping from them and barricading them from coming towards you. The health meter is symbolized by Daniel's actual heart, which has 4 levels of health. Green means healthy with the text, "All is good" displayed. Yellow is when he takes some damage and the text, "Few cuts and bruises" appears. Orange is when he continues to take damage with the text, "A wound is bleeding quite badly." And finally, red means critically damaged with the text, "Barely conscious" appearing. Every time the player is confronted by monsters, remains in the dark too long, or witnesses unsettling events, the player begins to lose sanity, resulting in a distorted screen imitating the character's mental suffering. Sanity is a mechanic that affects dynamic gameplay, as the player is directly affected by it, leaving the player vulnerable if their sanity drops too low, or even die if you're playing on hard difficulty. There are 4 states to sanity, just like the health bar, going from green to yellow to orange and finally to red. The player can check these meters in the inventory panel. Along with that, they may check for current items and also check for how much oil is left for the lamp. The player must also check mementos in order to understand where to go and what to do next.
The game takes place in a castle called Brennenburg, surrounded by forests in 1839 Prussia. The story revolved around Daniel having a mission to go into the inner sanctum to kill a man named Alexander, who was the baron of the castle. Daniel is to explore the castle, coming across notes, diary entries, and mementos, which help him progress through towards his goal. He must avoid and run from various deformed monsters on his journey while not having the ability to fight back. Through experience-driven gameplay, Amnesia immerses the player into a simulation of a living nightmare. Knowing that there are no weapons or other ways of killing the monsters, the player is in a constant state of fear of having to encounter these monsters and gamble with ways of successfully evading them. Fear is played around further when players try their best to focus on not alerting the presence of the monsters to their location by being as quiet and subtle as possible. Music soundtracks are critical in building up the player's flight response in the events of scary encounters or chases, or while the player is in hiding. Eerie music is played, conveying that the creature is nearby searching for the player. The sounds of rain and howling of the wind in the background of the level made the player feel a sense of isolation and a reminder that they face these challenges of hiding from monsters and solving puzzles alone.
The controls of Amnesia are straightforward and simple, yet offer many possibilities in giving the player ways of interacting with the environment and using surrounding objects in the area to their advantage. An example: the player can pick up an object holding left click. Holding the R key rotates the held object, and finally the object can be thrown by pressing right click. This is useful in luring or distracting monsters by throwing objects in another area, producing sound. The player is given the chance to safely move away from the threat without triggering a pursuit. With a small set of verbs, the player is offered countless ways of gameplay. However, interactive objects also have setbacks. Since most of the objects in the game can be moved, it also means the player has to be careful not to knock things over or drop objects, creating loud noises that eventually attracts nearby monsters. The player can temporarily halt chases by running through an interactive door and shutting and locking it behind. The player can use objects in the room to barricade the door, or other player may use the Q and E keys to tilt their heads and peek while hiding, giving the player time to formulate a plan of escape. However, keeping the monster out will only fuel its anger and determination to kill the player, causing it to break through.
Perhaps the player does have one friend in the game, the lantern. The player is often finding themselves navigating through the dark areas in the level. To a certain extent, the dark gives the player an edge in hiding from monsters briefly. However, being in the dark too long causes the player to lose their sanity, making it harder to escape. The lantern, being a portable source of light, helps brighten areas, making the search for key items easier and allow players to spend more time exploring the map. The lantern, despite its usefulness, does come with a limited supply of oil. Oil is needed to sustain the lantern's light. Oil can be found scattered across the map. It would be best for the player to preserve the lantern as much as they can. The best way for this is for the player to light candles, torches, fires, and stationary lamps around the map using tinderboxes. Tinderboxes, like oil for lanterns, ignite light sources. There are a total of 151 tinderboxes to find around the map. One particular advantage of the light sources is that they will never run out. Players are able to backtrack in certain areas of the level without needing to use their lantern and waste their precious oil supply, and keep areas lit so that it is easier to see and keep the player's sanity level full.
Amnesia's expectations of a good horror game would not be if not for the use of sound. Sound is what allows the player's experience to be truly immersive, adding frightening effects and enhancing the horrific atmosphere. One significant example of sound at its best is the terror meter. A soundtrack is produced and gradually built up once a monster begins chasing the player. The high-pitched screeching noise, similar to a siren, followed by the soundtrack of the monster being blended, is enough to make the player feel unsafe and start panicking, indicating to the player that the monster is now locked on and chasing, telling the player to run and hide quickly. Another iconic part of the game using sound to enhance a scary moment in the game is the cellar archives, where the player has no choice but traverse through the water, giving chase to an invisible creature known as the Carnix. Stepping into the water cues the music and sound effects to let the player know that there is an impending threat.
The developers of the game went for a design that was heavily influenced by a place called Malbork Castle, which is located in modern-day Poland or medieval East Prussia, where the story of the game also takes place. The attention to detail in regards to the architecture and setting of the castle itself gives the player a better understanding of the theme of the game. The castle interior displays broken roofs, walls, and floors to show the state of decay and destruction within the old castle. Looking out of the window, the player can see the castle enveloped by a mysterious fog with many trees surrounding it. The people who made the game put extreme emphasis on the objects and physics of those objects. The sound the objects make is relative to how fast you put it down or throw it, and the sound created by the object depends on what the object is made of. For example, glass bottles clinking on impact or the door creaking when opened slowly. The player has the ability to control how fast they can open drawers, closets, and doors in the area, and objects within drawers also move according to how fast you pull them. Opening doors and closets, which are obstructed by objects, can produce a sound relative to how fast you open it and hit the obstructed object, giving players a need to use caution while entering or leaving the premise.